Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. My allergies are absolutely kicking my ass today. So if I don't look 100% well, that is why. I literally cannot stop sneezing. Despite my allergies driving me nuts today, I've been working on this video for over a week now, and I really wanted to get it out for you guys. And this case today that I'm covering is the first serial killer case that I've ever covered. And I'm going to warn you guys now, it's a pretty terrifying one, so you're going to need to brace yourselves. But today we are going to be talking about a man who has gotten the name of one of Canada's worst serial killers, and this man's name is Bruce McArthur. And Bruce was known for targeting gay men in Toronto's Gay Village area. And this is a very recent case. This is a case that just happened in the last 10 or so years. And it's a case that I honestly had never heard about. And I'm surprised that I hadn't, because again, he is one of Canada's worst serial killers, and I've never heard anyone talk about him. Today, we're going to break that, and we're going to talk about this man. So grab yourself an iced coffee, start your cleaning, whatever you do when you watch these type of videos. But either way, buckle up, because today's case is going to be a little bit of a lengthy one. And again, it's a case I hadn't really heard of, considering that this man is up there in leagues with Dennis Rader. Bruce McArthur, who was actually born Thomas Donald Bruce McArthur, was born October 8th of 1951 in Lindsay, Ontario, to an Irish Catholic mother and Scottish father. Growing up, Bruce was raised on a farm in the Kawartha Lakes region with his sister and parents, along with the children his parents would foster. From what I read, his parents would foster anywhere from around 6 to 10 children at any given time. And these kids would be troubled kids from the Toronto area whose parents wanted them to get out of the city and would want them to, go and learn what it was like to do hard work on a farm, things like that, But friends of the family would say that the McArthurs had a really good reputation in the area. They were a really well-liked family. Little Bruce would eventually attend a one-room schoolhouse outside Woodsville, where classmates would describe him as a teacher's pet and a tattletale. He would never get into the trouble like the other kids. Instead, he loved being the one to tell on the other kids if they were being bad. And this little boy, Bruce McArthur, for all intent and purposes, was a normal kid compared to the monster that he turned out to be. So things seemed great in the McArthur home, but I did see mention that his parents would sometimes fight over their differing religions, and tensions arose when Bruce's father suspected him of being homosexual, and this caused his father to be extra strict with him and to mock him. We do have to remember that this was back in the time when the LGBTQ community was not accepted, especially in conservative rural Ontario. And because of all this, it would make sense that Bruce would have trouble accepting his sexuality, and he would feel this immense pressure to conform. So overall, this is the home life that Bruce grew up in. Bruce would later graduate high school in 1970, and he would end up marrying his high school sweetheart, Janice Campbell, when he was 23 years old. Grunge.com is quoted saying, "The National Post notes the irony and the pet peeve his future wife listed in their high school yearbook." And here, as you can see next to her picture in her high school yearbook, it says, "Someone who can't decide what they want," which they say is ironic because Bruce would spend the better part of the next 3 decades not being able to decide what he wanted. So the year before Bruce graduated in 1969, same-sex adult behavior had become decriminalized finally, which nowadays seems so crazy that it was even illegal to begin with. And around this time in Toronto and in the following years around the streets of College and Wellesley, what is now known as our gay district or our gay village was starting to form in Toronto. And keep this in mind because this area is going to be very important later on in the story. But back to Bruce. So in the 70s, it's believed that Bruce worked at Eaton's, which was actually only a few blocks away from this gay village that was starting to form in Toronto. Eaton's was a department store kind of like Nordstrom or the Bay. But Bruce wasn't living in Toronto at the time. Him and his wife actually moved to Oshawa, which is a town just outside of Toronto. And they would eventually purchase a home there in the 80s. The couple would also have a daughter named Melanie and a son named Todd in the following years. Bruce was around 35 at this time, and he was trying to do everything he could to distract himself from his homosexual feelings. He had the wife, the house, the kids, the church. Bruce's family at this time was considered very vanilla and very perfect. They were like the picture perfect family. We've heard the story time and time again where people that were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, back in that time when being homosexual wasn't accepted back then, and they'd be berated for it. They'd have to suppress these feelings. They'd end up marrying a woman or a man, and then they'd have to suppress these feelings. They'd try to do everything to appear quote unquote straight in a way. And again, this isn't the first serial killer story where we've heard this happen. And of course, this picture perfect life that Bruce was trying to portray didn't fix the problem that Bruce felt like he had, which we all know nowadays is not a problem. There was nothing wrong with Bruce in that way. There definitely is something wrong with Bruce, but not in that way. But again, his upbringing made him feel that way, which again is a common theme in this time period. Also during this time, Bruce's parents died a couple years apart, so there was a lot going on in Bruce's life, and things would keep getting more and more complicated. In the late 80s, Bruce started working as a traveling salesman for McGregor and Stanfield, selling socks and underwear to department stores. And because of this, he ended up crisscrossing Ontario moving products, which, keep this in mind, we're going to chat about this a little later on. The 90s rolled in and got even more complicated for the family. Bruce allegedly began multiple affairs with men, but about a year later, he'd end up coming out to his wife and they'd still continue living together. Now, their son Todd is a big part of the story that I didn't see right away until I started digging deeper and deeper. And their son Todd, I think, is a major part of the story. So Todd was a teenager at this time in the 90s, and the way that articles worded it was that he was obsessively making obscene phone calls to women he didn't know, which he was then caught for, and this led to legal issues, which then, Bruce and his wife had to pay for. A National Post article is quoted saying he was racking up literally dozens of convictions for charges including harassment and making indecent phone calls, even going up to 2014, where Todd would be sentenced to 14 months in jail for admitting to the obscene phone calls. So as you're going to see, from the time that Bruce's son Todd was a teenager all the way up to his adulthood, he's going to have this history of what you could kind of call like sexual deviancy. Another quote from the National Post says, according to an agreed statement of facts reading into the record of his sentence, Todd phoned the woman and made repeated references to nude photos of her. He made sexually suggestive comments and asked her if she was wearing panties. During many of the calls, the statement said he would whisper her name just before he hung up the phone. As I said, Todd McArthur is a whole nother story. There's something going on there too, and he was actually diagnosed with what is called telephone scatologia. That is not how you pronounce it at all. So scatologia, I'm still pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, is a deviant sexual practice in which sexual pleasure is obtained through the compulsive use of obscene language, and he's doing this via the telephone. So basically, he gets off on making obscene phone calls to women. So yeah, something was seriously going wrong in this family. But it is noted that he had been being treated for 10 to 15 years for this, which clearly wasn't working because it was continuing to happen. Todd's reasoning for this diagnosis that he has is that he told his lawyer it was linked to depression that he had, and it might also be associated with his first sexual experience. His first sexual experience was an explicit conversation he had on the phone with an older woman when he was around 11 or 12 years old. There's so many questions revolving around that. Who was this woman? Why did this even happen? What was going on there? But keep in mind that all of this is going on leading all the way up to when Bruce is arrested. So obviously there's a lot to unpack there, but let's jump back to Bruce. It would be in the 90s when Bruce would end up losing his job at the clothing trade company, and it made their financial situation all that much worse. They eventually had to remortgage their home and declare bankruptcy in around 1999. So clearly there was a lot going on in the relationship between Janice and Bruce. There was their son, he was a sexual deviant. There was financial issues, Bruce losing his job. Bruce was also allegedly, cheating on her with other men. So after all of that, in 1999, they would end up separating finally. And I'm honestly really surprised that they lasted that long. And on top of that, they still maintained a pretty good relationship, it seemed like. So much so that when Janice's parents died in 2003 and 2007, Bruce was included in the obituary. So Bruce separates from his wife. He's on his own now, and he would end up moving to Toronto, and he would end up at an apartment on Don Mills Road. And it's noted that he left Oshawa because there was no gay community in the area at the time, and it was just a thing back then that anyone that was in the surrounding areas would go to Toronto and go to the gay village, and that's where they would, be able to freely express themselves, because there wasn't really anywhere else in the surrounding areas of the GTA and whatnot where they would feel fully accepted. Because we do have to remember that even though same-sex relationships were not illegal, same-sex marriage was still not legal at this time. It still wasn't fully accepted by everyone, even to just be gay, which again seems crazy nowadays in 2022. And, but it happened, and that this was what it was like at the time. And Bruce moved to Toronto to be able to express himself. Or let's hope it was for innocent reasons and not for what eventually would end up happening. Moving to Toronto would introduce Bruce to the gay village and the bars in the area of Church and Wellesley. This is also when Bruce would end up starting a landscaping company and working as a landscaper. A local bartender would note that Bruce's landscaping van was often seen in the area and that he was pretty well known in the community. Around this time, Bruce also began a relationship with a man named Skanda, and this relationship would last until around 2008. A friend of Skanda said Bruce seemed to be a jolly-looking man, pleasant, courteous, and seemed straight-laced. So although it seemed like Bruce was trying to get his life together, now he's living in Toronto, he's finally able to express himself. He has, a good job that's bringing in money for him. He has, his apartment. I think he has roommates, but he has, an apartment he's living in. Halloween of 2001 would roll around and everything would change. And this is when the story of a man trying to find himself would take a dark turn. It was a few weeks after Bruce turned 50 years old that he would attack his first victim. And his first victim's name would be Mark Henderson. And this man was a nurse, a model, and an actor. So Bruce and Mark had crossed paths before, but in interviews that Mark would make in current times, he said that he didn't really like Bruce and he had tried to steer clear from him. Now, what the reasoning and motivation for what happened next was, I don't really know, and no one really knows. The day Mark was attacked, he was living in a building in the gay village, and from his recollection, he was walking through the parking lot of that building to the back door, and he had unlocked it when he seen Bruce running after him, like he was trying to catch the back door before it closed. I'm sure that you've had that happen before. You're opening a door, someone's running over to catch it before it locks because they don't want to go all the way around the building, or they just want to get in too. And so Mark let him in. He really didn't think much of it. Mark's walking up to his apartment door. He's going to go unlock it, and Bruce is following behind him, and he expects Bruce to walk past him and go to the lobby, but that doesn't happen. Instead, Bruce pulls out a pipe and begins to strike Mark in the head with it.
Every muscle in his face was clenched. He was full of rage. I remember feeling the indentation in my skull. He had popped my skull in, and I have a nursing background. I see cerebral spinal fluid and blood coming down, and I think I'm going to lose consciousness in a matter of seconds, and he was not going to stop.
So as a last-ditch effort for Mark to save himself, he fought his way into his apartment and he called 911. And thankfully, Mark did get away and he was eventually taken to St. Michael's Hospital. Now, Mark's injuries were extensive. He ended up having a compound fracture to his skull and ended up needing several stitches to his head and fingers. He also had lacerations on his fingers. And it took 6 weeks for him to recover from this. This man was beaten bad. And what really surprises me about this case is after this assault, Bruce ends up leaving Mark's apartment and going directly to the police station and turning himself in. And you think the story would end here, but it doesn't. Bruce ends up claiming that he had a previous sexual relationship with Mark and that he did not remember the incident or why he may have done it. He literally says that he blacked out when it happened. Bruce was then charged with assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm. Here's where things get really fucked up though. And this is when the legal proceedings come in. And this is where we get to see just how bad the Canadian legal system is, or let's just say Toronto's, which we've seen before if we go back to the 90s with the Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo case. And this is a present day case 20 years later nearly, where this happened again pretty much. During the entire legal proceedings, Mark would end up being bashed for being an escort in his past, which Mark disputes in present day interviews, saying that he was 10 years sober at the time he was assaulted and he had changed his life. During the court proceedings for this assault, they were literally victim blaming the entire time. It's also noted in the documents from the trial that they blame Mark for letting Bruce into the building, saying that it may have been that Mr. McArthur believed that there was an opportunity for sex. What? In what world is holding a door open for someone an invitation for sex? This is just giving me some grimy college assault case. Does this not remind you of those college assaults where it's well, she was drunk and she was wearing a low-cut top, so she was asking for it. But this is the male-to-male version of that, where it's oh, he held the door open for him, so he obviously was trying to lure him into his apartment to have sex with him. And then when he was turned down, he violently beat him. It makes no sense. This whole first assault is ridiculous, and it just keeps getting worse. The victim blaming, it just blows my mind in this case. So Bruce would finally eventually admit that there actually had never been even a sexual history between the two. It's not even they had hooked up some time and then this happened. They literally had no sexual history. Mark says, he didn't even like Bruce. He tried to stay away from Bruce when he seen him out. So you think Bruce admitting that he lied about their sexual history would bring justice to this case. Bruce ends up pleading guilty, but no. Legal documents would also say that Bruce's evaluation showed he was not likely to reoffend. The judge could have gave Bruce 10 years for this assault, but instead Bruce would not spend 1 day in jail. Bruce would end up only getting 1 year of house arrest and then 2 years banned from the gay village and 3 years probation. The judge was literally quoted saying, You made a mistake on this particular day, but it sounds to me like you're a pretty good person, and it sounds to me like you're not going to be back here anyways. Those words did not age well, Judge. They did not age well at all. Mark's sister would be quoted saying that they basically gave Bruce a slap on the wrist, and if they didn't take a fractured skull seriously, what would it take? Well, it took 8 apparently. Now, despite all of this happening to Mark, which again is just absolutely ridiculous, like my heart goes out to him for living through this, Mark was actually so scared after Bruce was let off, and for good reason, that he ended up becoming a volunteer police officer, which I didn't even know was a thing, but he ended up serving from around 2007 to 2009, and he would work the annual Pride parades and a lot of other things. Mark Henderson's a really remarkable man, and I definitely recommend watching the 20-minute special that CTV did about him as being the first survivor and victim of Bruce McArthur. So I'll have that link below so you guys can watch the whole thing. Definitely recommend it. About 9 years would go by from the Halloween 2001 attack, and Bruce would be very quiet. But 2010 would roll around and men would start going missing. The first would be 3 men, 40-year-old Skandaraj Navaratam in 2010. And if you remember me mentioning earlier, Bruce was in a relationship with a man named Skanda. This was the man. And now police didn't know anything when Skandaraj went missing, that he had been in a relationship with Bruce or anything like that, it seems like. But it was eventually noted later that he ended up going missing 2 weeks after Bruce's daughter's wedding. The next man to go missing would be 44-year-old Abdul Basir Faizi, and then 58-year-old Majid Kayhan in October of 2012. These missing men would lead Toronto to start a task force in 2012 called Project Houston, which is a play off of the saying, Houston, we have a problem. They actually started this task force after acting on a tip that these men were victims of a cannibal ring. And Bruce would actually end up being brought in for questioning due to his violent past with Mark, but he would actually end up being released due to his criminal history only showing a minor assault and no jail time. And what's really scary is that this entire time that these men were going missing, Mark had a feeling deep down in the back of his mind that he knew who was responsible for these men going missing, and that it was Bruce. But Bruce had nearly murdered him and gotten away with it. So what else could Mark really do? So Bruce is let go, and the lead investigator in this case, whose name is Hank Idsigna, would eventually be scrutinized in an interview for letting Bruce go and not considering him a suspect from day one. So I'll play that clip for you now.
Toronto Police Inspector Hank Idsigna was the lead investigator in the McArthur case.
When Bruce McArthur walks in 2013, knowing some of the men who disappeared, with a criminal record of assaulting a man, does a red flag not go off and say, geez, maybe this is a guy we should look at more seriously?
It wasn't uncommon to interview witnesses who knew 1, 2, or 3 of those men. It also wasn't unusual to interview witnesses who had previous criminal records.
The fact that Bruce McArthur walks in and talks to a cop, turns around and walks out, feels strange and a failure.
I've often contemplated what really could have been done different if an investigator had twigged. Could surveillance have been put on Bruce McArthur? If we had to put surveillance on everyone that we interviewed who knew 1 or 3 of those guys who had a criminal record, I think that's a proposition that is not realistic.
In the end, the cannibal ring would turn out to be pretty much a hoax, which isn't surprising. But what wasn't a hoax were the men that continued to disappear. Somewhere in 2014 is when Bruce's son Todd was caught and sentenced for making those lewd sexual phone calls. And Todd's parents were actually described as extremely supportive towards Todd. Todd was also ordered to live with Bruce for a time being, and also started working with his father's company in the landscaping business. So now we have 2 sexual predators who are now living together. Wonderful work. Canadian justice system. Wonderful work. Now, I didn't really find how long Todd would end up living with his father, but we just do know around this time that Todd was living with his father and he worked with him for a period of time. And again, more men would continue going missing in the following years. 50-year-old Sarush Mahmoodi and 37-year-old Karushna Kumar Kanagaratam would both disappear in 2015. And if you haven't realized this trend yet, seeing the photos of these men going missing, up until 2016, all of these men were of South Asian and Middle Eastern descent, which seemed to be Bruce's type. Then, in April of 2016, the profile would change a little bit because a 27-year-old man named Dean Lisowick would go missing. And Dean, from what I've seen, was a homeless man, but he was also really well liked in the area. It's really strange when you compare Dean to these other men that went missing. It's like Bruce seemed to have a pattern, and then he kind of changed it, which is a little bit odd. But again, we don't really understand why. 2 months would go by, and then in June of 2016, an unidentified caller calls 911 stating that a man had just tried to strangle him to death and that his name was Bruce. This man ended up escaping Bruce, and it would be a repeat of Mark Henderson's attack because who comes walking back to the police station other than Bruce McArthur, turning himself in again for an escaped failed murder? It's crazy. You can't write this stuff. Once again, Bruce claims he didn't do anything wrong and that it was a lover's spat, which honestly is just giving me really strong Jeffrey Dahmer vibes. If you know anything about Jeffrey Dahmer's MO and stuff, he would drill into the brains of his victims and pour acid in them. And he was trying to make them his zombie lovers. But this one child, literally a child, or young teenage boy that he kidnapped, escaped him and ran into the street, and the police were called. And Jeffrey came out and literally lied to the police, saying that this young teenage boy was actually his boyfriend and his lover, and that he was drunk or whatever and was upset. But what's so messed up is that the cop would end up just letting Jeffrey take this young teenage boy back because he didn't want to get involved in this gay lover's argument, which is not what it was at all. And that's exactly what this sounds like. It's just so sickening. Bruce walks into the police station and literally confesses to nearly murdering someone and saying that it was a lover's spat, and the police are oh, okay, that's fine. This is a DV case then. Why did nothing happen? Because they were two men? It doesn't make any sense to me. We know how messed up the justice system is with DV cases between men and women. Clearly, it's just as bad when it's between two men, because the police just don't want to get involved in it, seems like. And again, this is current times. We have to remember that this case happened just a few years ago. This happened. This isn't back in the 1980s or 60s or 50s. This is current times this is happening. Just like that, the police believe Bruce again and no charges were filed. And you want to know what the kicker is with this second time Bruce went into the police station? Well, the police ended up letting him go because Bruce had no charges on his file. And you know why? Because when Bruce was taken in for questioning for the three men that went missing, Bruce ended up leaving the police station when he was let go and going and getting a pardon for his previous charges. So now Bruce's criminal record was completely wiped clean. How mind-blowing is that? So when that second victim escaped, Bruce went and turned himself in confidently, knowing that he had no charges on his file anymore and he had a clean record. And he knew the first time a victim escaped that he was let off because he had no charges. The second time the victim escaped, he was once again let off because he had no charges. This man's ego must have been through the fucking roof. Whew. Okay, I need to cool down and keep going on with the story because I could talk about this for a long, long time. We're now in April of 2017. Just 4 years ago, keep that in mind. 4 years ago. Less than a year after that second man escaped and called the police, another man would go missing. And this was 44-year-old Celine Essam. And 2 months after that, in June, Bruce would make a mistake because 49-year-old Andrew Kingsman would disappear. Andrew Kingsman's family would immediately report him missing. Now, 8 men were missing, and there were no sign of them, and there were no suspects. This is when Mark Henderson comes back into the story because he steps up and he decides to finally call the police and leave a tip about Bruce possibly being involved with the murders. Because as I said earlier, Mark was watching the news, he was seeing all of these men going missing, and he had this really bad feeling. And I don't want to see anything bad said about Mark Henderson in this comment section, because yes, it took him a long time to report to the police that he was suspicious of Bruce, but you do have to go back and remember everything that had happened to Mark previously. He had been let down by the justice system over and over again in this case. So why would they listen to him now? Well, so from what it looks like, the first 7 men that went missing, I don't want to say no one was looking for them because clearly there were people looking for them, but it wasn't until the 8th victim, Andrew Kingsman, went missing that police really started being pressured, and all the clues were leading straight to one person. Bruce McArthur. Bruce McArthur was arrested on January 18th of 2018. Again, 4 years ago, guys. And this is wild. Police would get a warrant to search Bruce's apartment, and they would end up breaking down his apartment door. And there they would find a young man handcuffed to the bed. Now, there's not much information on this man. He seems to kind of be unidentified. I don't know if he just doesn't want his identity made public or whatnot, which is totally his right. It might be out there for his safety or whatnot. But so he was working on his 9th victim when police caught him. Technically, 11 if you want to count Mark and the other man that got away. God knows how many other people are out there that Bruce attacked or murdered. Things continue to unfold now because where are all these missing men? January 21st, reporters capture crime scene techs carrying a heavy planter out of the property of Ron Smith and Karen Fraser. And Karen and Ron said that they knew Bruce because he was a friend's brother and he'd asked to use their garage to store some of his landscaping tools in exchange for doing yard work over the last decade or so. He was said to donate flowers to their charity events. He even brought planters full of flowers and told Karen Fraser that he wanted to keep them there at her home in the backyard so that he could look at them while him and his crew ate their lunch. But little did Karen and Ron know that inside of these planters that Bruce was putting in their yard and in their garage to sit and stare at while he ate his lunch, little did they know inside of those very planters were some of the bodies of the missing men. Karen and Ron would end up being kicked out of their home for nearly a month while police searched their property, which has to honestly be really hard being removed from your home and realizing that your home was literally a burial ground for missing men. Like, I can't even imagine. Like, I do feel for them. Like, they were not involved at this at all. They were ruled out. Like, they were literally just trying to be kind to this man who honestly seemed to have been kind to them. They were just trying to do a good deed. And in turn, they were literally allowing a man unknowingly to bury bodies on their property, which is just horrific. Eventually, Karen and Ron would be allowed back into their home, but searchers would continue to dig in their backyard. July rolled around and police returned to check an area near the ravine behind their home where police dogs had picked up a scent. And here the remains of the 8th victim were found. Every night, Ron and Karen light a candle on their porch for the victims, and they actually had a priest in what is called an imam plus the property. There's also a lot of people that like to drive by their home and look at their home. Guys, their address is out there, but I'm purposely not saying their address or putting their address in this video because the video I'm creating today about this case isn't to put their address on blast and for people to go there and stare at their home like it's some sideshow. As I said, this couple was completely ruled out. They weren't involved in this murder. It just so happened that they ended up doing a good deed and they were taken advantage of. And so I don't feel like this couple deserves to be harassed or for people to go up to their home and take pictures of it. And so I just ask you guys, please don't do that. So I'm going to put the 8 men's pictures back up on the screen right now. I just want you guys to all take a look at them and remember these men because they did not deserve to die at the hands of this monster or any monster, but let alone Bruce McArthur, because I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about what is suspected Bruce did with these men and whatnot, but it's horrific. But what I'm about to tell you is why Bruce McArthur is known as one of Canada's worst serial killers and why he is compared to Dennis Rader. So Bruce never actually went on trial for these murders because he ended up pleading guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder, and which is honestly why we may never get a motive or a real reason from Bruce to why he did any of this. He's never really given a reason to why he ended up murdering all these men. Like a lot of serial killers, we can look back into his past and possibly him being berated by his father for being gay and him in turn lashing out against other gay men who freely expressed themselves because he didn't feel like he could. And he was kind of in a way jealous of them. Now, that's just my opinion. I'm just saying that because we've seen this before. Now, it is noted that some of the men that were victims were actually closeted, like their families didn't know that they were gay, and there's a lot of like religious reasons and whatnot behind that because again, a lot of these men were South Asian and of Middle Eastern descent. As I said, all of that's just speculation because Bruce never actually said why he did any of this. And again, what's really strange about this case is that despite how Bruce was ridiculed by his father as a child and stuff, it seems that he ended up coming out to his wife in 1999. He ended up coming out to his family. And, I didn't see anywhere where Bruce was like shunned by his family for being homosexuals. Bruce McArthur seemed to be living the perfect life. He had a landscaping business. He still had a good relationship with his ex-wife. He was living in Toronto where being gay is really openly accepted. Everyone that knew Bruce had nothing but like good things to say about him, it seemed, which we see a lot with serial killers. They're very good at manipulating people and coming off a certain way to people. But that's the thing that makes this so confusing and complicated. It makes looking into serial killers and why serial killers do what they do and the way they think so interesting. Bruce had multiple opportunities to just live a good life, but instead he chose murder. On top of that, what's really interesting is it seems that he lived 50 years with no known victims or violent history until his attack on Mark Henderson, which is just odd because serial killers normally manifest and start killing in their, early to late 30s. Mark was 50. It's just really strange. And I found an article from CBC. I'll have it linked down below. And it's called How Bruce McArthur's 8 Murders Fit a Pattern with Other Serial Killers that I found really interesting. And I really recommend reading this article. But from what I read in it, this is where they compare Bruce to Dennis Rader, who would tie up his victims, strangle them to death, death and photograph them in grotesque positions, citing that Bruce had also killed his victims by using ligature strangulation, just as, he attempted to do on Mark and that unknown caller. And I also didn't know this until I read this article, but again, this is where you can skip it if you don't want to hear the gruesome kind of details. This is where this article says, and they compare him to Dennis Rader because they say Bruce ended up posing his victims naked with cigars in their mouth, shaved, and at times made to wear a fur coat and hat. And Bruce would pose them in his bedroom or vehicle with their eyes closed and a ligature around their neck, and then he would photograph them. There's also photo evidence that the victims were restrained and SA'd, which is just terrifying as well, because when they broke down Bruce's apartment door and they found that man handcuffed to the bed, that this was all going to happen to that man as well. And this is what happened to those previous 8 men and what could have happened to Mark and that unknown caller. After I read this, I realized that Bruce McArthur was a darker and scarier man than any of us ever would know. The author also wrote, and I quote, McArthur kept some personal belongings like bracelets and notepads, and also kept digital files of all the victims, categorized them in subfolders. Many which actions, say experts who study the behavior of serial killers, have marked the behavior of other notorious murderers. Bruce also seemed to have rituals of restraining his victims, carefully planning the murders, and disposing of the bodies. Bruce is also described as an organized killer with a pattern, which after hearing that is just terrifying, knowing that this man was walking the streets and had law enforcement wrapped around his finger. Now, also going back quickly to when Bruce was a traveling salesman, how I mentioned that serial killers usually start killing people around their early 30s to late 30s. This is when Bruce was a traveling salesman and he was traveling Ontario, going back and forth across the province. So this makes people wonder, did Bruce really just snap when he was 50 years old and start murdering people? Or are there other victims out there that we don't know about from years and years back when Bruce was a traveling salesman? Because that's normally when serial killers start killing. Could Bruce potentially be like the Golden State Killer and have been killing for decades and no one knew about it until he was in his 50s and he started killing in Toronto, which is a much bigger city, and people started connecting the dots? How many bodies could be scattered across the province? Because just like a trucker, Bruce was a solo traveler going across the province, and he was there one day and gone the next, which sounds really convenient for a serial killer. Okay, before I end this video, I think we can all agree that the police majorly fucked up in this case. And I can say that pretty confidently because there's actually what is called an independent civilian review against the police, which is led by retired Justice Gloria Epstein. There's also lawyers on it, and they want the police to take accountability for how they conducted their investigation into these missing men, who the lawyer on the case feels were mislooked because they were predominantly gay, South Asian, and Middle Eastern men. Some were also homeless. So that makes you wonder, did this also play a role into why police didn't really take these men going missing seriously? On top of that, if we bring back Mark's case again, which was severely mishandled, it 100%, in my opinion, seems like there was a bias because they were making it seem like Mark was just a gay prostitute who led Bruce on. And again, this isn't the 1950s when this is happening. This is present day 2000s in Toronto, which is one of Canada's biggest cities. Police had 3 separate opportunities to get Bruce off the streets, and they failed each one of those. It took 8 years and 8 dead men. And of course, the police deny all of this, and they think that they did a phenomenal job, which is words directly from the mouth of the lead detective. And when questioned on what the police should have done better, the detective doesn't have an answer, which is not surprising. So how do you guys feel about this case? What's crazy to me is living in Toronto my entire life, I don't remember hearing about these men going missing. And maybe that's just because I don't really watch the news, but you'd think I'd see it on social media, and I didn't. Yeah, the entire time I was walking these streets in Toronto, and everyone else was walking these streets, there is a serial killer preying on these men. And it makes you wonder, in present day time, how many serial killers are out there right now living under the radar? And when you hear these older serial killer cases like the Jeffrey Dahmers and the Ted Bundy stories, you think about them and you kind of understand, well, there wasn't really that much surveillance back then. There wasn't really that much, DNA evidence, and they didn't have the proper training. They didn't have the tools that they have nowadays. They didn't have the knowledge of serial killers like they do now. But this is a present day case, not a case that happened 50 years ago. And despite all the technology that we have now and the education we have now that law enforcement should have, Bruce was able to get away for decades. And again, it makes you wonder, how many more serial killers are out there right now manipulating the police and have them wrapped around their fingers, or are living next door to us right now, are going to church with you? It really makes you wonder. And it's terrifying. I hope you guys enjoyed this case today. I really hope more people start talking about this case because I think it's insane. I think it's crazy that no one's really talking about this man. And he's one of the biggest serial killers in Canadian history. And he did things just as horrific as all the other serial killers that he's not really talked about. So I hope you guys enjoyed this case today. Let's have a huge chat about it below because, again, I never heard of it. I want to know if you guys knew about this case. And yeah, what do you think about it? Are you just as enraged with what happened as I am? And does this case make you really weary about who you're walking down the street with? This is the case of serial killer Bruce McArthur, and I will see you guys in next week's video. Bye.